I'm happy to be here to present this work on the tactical use of sensory modalities by primate infants. And this is really a work in progress, and I will be happy to get your feedback in the end. so just to set the context, I wanted to start working on multimodal communication a couple of years ago, and I thought that the field were lacking from a theory, or it was just the beginning. And I got inspired by a proposal by Dean Falk, who is an American anthropologist, and I wanted to push her theory a little further with the idea of derivating some testable prediction to guide empirical research. So that's quite ambitious, and at the same time it's not that much, so we'll see. So my starting point is that I consider language as a multimodal phenomenon, and I will show you this video. So you can see here. So you can see the head of the baby is moving. You can see the eyelid moving. He's orienting toward the adults. Oh, I was supposed to show you another part, but I cannot succeed. So anyway, so the idea that I wanted to express here is that multimodality is not just speech on one side and gestures or co-speech gestures on the other side. This is much more complex than that. This is much more multidimensional, and I think that multimodality can pop up at any scale of our body and at different language layers. That's the idea. And so I think there are two main reasons why scientists should not neglect the multimodal facets of language. And the first one is that babies just do not. And from Baya told us about that just before, and you have 2 months-old children that are able to match the pattern, the phonetic pattern of the lips, and the sound that are the sound from people that are speaking vowels in front of them from 2 months old onwards. So it's very early. And the second aspect is, the second argument is that other animals and non-human primates, but also other animals, just do not neglect the multimodal aspect of their communication. And multimodal communication is so widespread that it has pushed recently some scientists to assume the continuity between the multimodal communication in non-human primates until the multimodal human communication. So if we assume continuity, but still we deny the use of multimodal language to other species, we need to be very precise to specify what is different or what is similar across the different species. And for that, I used an approach of language which is a multi-component or multi-layered approach. And that goes from the biological adaptations until the conversational skills. And I like this approach because you can think of all the layers that are at stake altogether when we use language. And you can also think of multimodality within a spatial layer, but also across the different layers. So I think it's worth exploring this idea for future research. And so even so, though it is technically possible to describe multimodal communication using this framework, the question of the origins of multimodal communication remains unresolved to date. And so far, all those previous studies and the debates over the origins of language have turned around the gestural origin on one side or the vocal origins on the other side. But this is like the pieces of a puzzle that doesn't match with the multimodal facets of human language or of modern language. And so this has been coined the transition problem, which refers to the problem of how did we evolve from a communicative, a gestural communication system from a speech, or the other way around. And I think that this transition problem expressed the failure of any model, theoretical model of language origins to explain why do we speak with our hand at the same time that our speech. And you can think of this transition problem at the scale of the world language, or all the layers, but you can think of this transition problem at each layer separately. And this is the approach I will take here. And for example, I will focus the rest of my speech on the conceptual intentional layer, and especially on intentionality. And then you can set the transition problem on intentional signaling at the scale of evolution, but also at the scale of development or ontogeny. So here, at the scale of evolution, the question is whether intentional signaling evolved from vocal or gestural or multimodal signals. And what we know from the works in ape communication or in monkeys, non-human primates communication in general, is that their gestural visual system is mostly intentional, but that the vision is much more limited. But it is not inexistent. So it is I think, very informative to look deeper at the context in which it occurs. Then, at the scale of infant development or children development, the question would be, how do children go from their first pointing gesture, which are intentional visual signals, to their first spoken word, which are intentional acoustic signals. And then, here also we like a lot of developmental studies focusing on the use of intentional acoustic communication before speech onset, because people tend to focus on the first words. So we don't know very well if they use intentional communication outside speech. So I decided to tackle the transition problem differently, and I was looking for mechanisms that could account for the emergence of intentional multimodal communication. And for doing that, I will present the fault hypothesis that I told you just before. So I will explain you the hypothesis, and then I will explain how I will extend it with some proximal mechanisms, and present you some testable predictions that could guide data collection. So that's the idea. So back to Falk. So Falk's called her hypothesis putting the baby down. And according to her, there are lots of skeleton changes that were associated with bipedalism, and that would have prevented early hominin infants to climb on their mothers for different reasons. First, because the mothers became vertical and possibly earless, and secondly, because infants became more altricial, which means that they were more immature, for their brain were not mature, their muscles were not mature, and third thing, you had a rigidification of the hominin feet that prevents the baby to grasp, like on the photo of the chimpanzees. So the first consequence of that is that hominin mothers had to carry their babies in arms. That's the first idea. And it led to a behavioral innovation in our species, which is cradling behavior. So cradling behavior is when you keep your baby here. And you can see here a mother found still cradling her baby after almost 5,000 years. And it has made the journalist very inspired and poetic about that. But it had made me think that it was very costly behavior to carry your baby so long. But nevertheless, now fathers want to follow suit. And at least on Google, you find many fathers cradling infants, much more than mother, much more than women. And some of them rears on other pups. But joking aside, the idea, the point that I want to make here is that I'm using mothers everywhere throughout my talk, but it's completely inaccurate. In every society, you have many caregivers around the babies. And so the use of mother is to take like a pinch of salt or as a symbol, or main caregiver. So whoever the caregiver, the idea raised by Falk is that cradling is very costly. And so you had to put the baby down sometimes. So this is the second consequence. So mothers had to put their baby down to free their hand. And this has made a big change in the tactile context between the mother and infants. So the physical proximity changed due to that. And it increased the distance between the mother and the children. And her idea or proposition was that hominin mothers would have soothed their babies using rhythmic song-like calls, like she called motherese. She sees there the precursor of motherese because of the increased distance between the mother and her children. So she concludes that the prelinguistic substrate for proto-language began from infant-directed vocalizations, or motherese, used to comfort distant infants. So that was the initial proposal. So I see a lot of strange and interesting ideas in what Folk proposed a couple of years ago, and I don't have the time to go into all details, but just I want to focus on this one. I think she made a big point by focusing on artificiality and on the decrease in physical proximity between mother and infant, because it has changed the communicative settings between individuals. And especially, it has most probably promoted the distal communication and the probably face-to-face interaction also, which are big components of our maternal behavior. So I just went a little further and I reformulated Folk's hypothesis just to make it fit with multimodal communication, which was easy. So it gives the prelinguistic substrates for a multimodal proto-language began to evolve from infant-directed multimodal communication and not only songs or speech. And this multimodal communication replaced the tactile contact or physical proximity. And then I argue that one of the mechanisms for that could be that infants get the more prevalent distal communication was exposed infants to their mother's face much more than before, and it has increased the sensitivity to others' gaze and visual attention, but also increased the sensitivity to the description of this attention. So they were early hominin has become more sensitive both to visual attention and to its description. And my argument is that description in maternal visual attention can trigger the tactical use of different sensory modality to channel communication and pair bonding by young infants. So this hypothesis gathers some support from different kind of arguments, and I will try to be quick, but I can address the first point was the withdrawal of attention is important, and I think that for artificial species, it becomes an evolutionary urgent situation for a young baby to be perceived and attended to, and so it might have been associated with selection pressure on infant communication. The second argument is why visual attention, and I think we can think of this hypothesis more broadly than just visual attention, but I think visual attention is the main point about human social cognition. And my point here is that the more prevalent distal communication may be a drive for the emergence of our human-specific visual sociocognition. All of the gaze skills that we are very attuned to. And then, why do I expect a multimodal output of that? But first is that mothers are multimodal themselves. So if they are the model to copy, so this is a multimodal model. And then the second source of argument comes from the empirical evidence of multimodal attention getters that we observe in specific captive settings in primates who are deprived for free movement. And I think it is like a quasi-experimental situation of artificiality. So they cannot forage by themselves, they cannot move by themselves. And I will go deeper and just illustrate this last point with a couple of studies. This one is on baboons who are involved in a food recrestic paradigm. And so you can see here their requesting gesture is to get food, and it is directed to a human experimenter. And so you can see on this graph that they use their visual gesture, like this one, more often when the experimenter can see them, while they are using auditory-based gesture when the experimenter cannot see them. And this auditory-based gesture in baboons were only gestural. It was cage banging, mostly cage banging. So you have a couple of studies in chimpanzees that are more or less based on the same idea, except that chimpanzees have a wider range of acoustic attention getters, and so they can clap and, or they can bang the cage also, or make vocal and lip sounds to attract the attention of an inattentive human. And these similar studies have also been performed with children. And there are like 6 or 7 studies, and I just picked one, but they are more or less built on the same idea. Infants are engaged in a book reading activity with their mother, and when the mother is not looking at the target of children's pointing, children can vocalize to attract her attention. And this is what you see on this graph, is the time spent vocalizing when the mother is not looking at the target pointed by the infant. And so you have also here the use of vocalization as attention getter. But the problem with human studies is that usually the researcher puts in vocalization, you have words and non-words, and it's all mixed, and you don't know really what happened. So if you are interested in this topic, you can attend the talk from Mawa on Wednesday, so who is here in the room. And we had tested 6-month-old children in similar experimental design, so the idea was to vary the attention of the mother and her interaction. So now it's the time for some prediction. The idea to test this hypothesis is to have at least, at the minimum, 2 different populations of humans and 2 different species of non-humans, and I expect a higher variation between humans and non-humans than within humans and within non-humans, or between non-human primate species. That's the idea. So, according to all this work, the time spent in tactile contact should be lower in humans than in non-humans. The rate of distal and face-to-face interaction should be higher in humans than in non-humans. The maternal active attention is a big word, but it means mothers' engagement, all sorts of things that mothers do actively toward the child should be higher in humans than in non-humans, and infants' use of attention getters toward inattentive mothers should be also higher in humans than in non-humans. But then you can make some different hypotheses about linked to the socioecology of the non-human species. You can also derive some testable prediction within the human species by comparing the different culture or population. So, for example, if you take 2 populations that differ in the time spent in physical contact between mother and infant, with the baby, you can expect the similar differences than with other species. For example, that if in this population mothers spend more time in tactile contact with their baby, you will have a lower rate of distal communication and face-to-face communication. You will have a lower rate of mothers and joint engagement, but you will have also frequency of attention getters will be lower in this population than in the others, and the modality of attention getters might be different according to the communicative settings. To sum up and to conclude, so according to Falk, the skeleton changes linked to bipedalism had increased infant locomotory maturity, which has increased the distance between mother and child and children. And then as a consequence, the mother started to soothe their baby with this rhythmic call or to communicate to their baby distally. And it has, as a consequence, infants start just by copying the mother. They did the same. So what I propose is a mechanism here which is very focused on the intentional use of the signal modalities, that the infant's exposure to mother's face had increased due to this distal communication, this distal setting, and it has increased infant sensitivity to social attention, and which has in turn triggers the tactical use of sensory modality to regain the mother's attention or to maintain the mother's attention. So my main point is that the disruption of attention is an important context to look at, because it could be a specific social loss likely to trigger the use of tactical use of sensory modality to maintain the communication. And to me, it would be a pathway to intentional multimodal communication. And I think that on this point particularly, we can learn a lot about the neuroscience of visual cognition. And finally, the future studies should bring quantitative description across species and cultures, and it should let us know what happened when putting the baby down from different perspectives, baboon or chimpanzee or humans. Thank you for your attention, and I would like to thank my collaborator and my founders. And I don't know if I'm in time or not. I'm not in time. Okay.